first question to Thomas Danne from Hannover, and his question is, why screen? What are the benefits for the child and the family? And you can answer this from two aspects, from the genetic testing as well as the diagnosing autoimmunity, Thomas. So I give you this.
Oh, thank you very much, Annette. I want to answer this question also from two perspectives. First of all, I'm taking care of children with diabetes for more than a quarter of a century. And on the other hand, I'm also a father. I have, 4 children. And luckily, they don't have diabetes. So first start with the father. If I look at the data coming from Sweden, which were just published in August in Lancet, that exactly this very young age group of people who get diabetes below 10 years of age have a loss of life of 17 years when it's a girl and 14 years when it's a boy. Those are numbers that, give me goosebumps. I'm trying to be an optimist in my role as a pediatric diabetologist, and I'm saying, treatment is getting better. We have diabetes technology coming. There's so many things that we can do for you. And I've seen all the improvements over 25 years. So clearly, yes, we're doing better. But we are still not there. And diabetes, full-blown diabetes, still is an enormous health hazard that for me as a father would be unacceptable for my children. I would want to know it as early as possible. Like I, as an old man, want to know, do I have risk for a cancer, of which I would be very happy to start any experimental treatment, which might give me some extra life. And I think the screening will give us this option for finding ways to give extra life to these children. And so as a pediatric diabetologist, I'm often congratulated about our efforts that we're doing better and better, and I feel like that. But we really have to move now, if we look at the very youngest age group, that the diagnosis is no longer there when people have the classical symptoms, but the diagnosis is there either with genetic screening or with picking up autoimmunity. I think both approaches are valid and good and should be followed. And they give us different options where we would go with prevention. And I'm a firm believer that this is really the next step to treat diabetes. And it's already well established with the studies that we have done. So my answer is clearly, this is a call to action to all the people who are decision makers in healthcare. And we should really pressure them to put this in general healthcare, because this is the only way that we will make this next step in diabetes treatment, not starting it at the stage of symptoms, but at the stage of diagnosis, which is much earlier in my mind, particularly in the young ones.
So diabetes is increasing very much in incidence. Do you think there is hope that your perspective is heard in the future, and or what do you think are the hurdles or the negative sides that prevent others to take it on, or to prevent our people to take it on?
Well, I think the biggest problem of us pediatricians is, or the pediatric diabetologists, that we are trained to be optimists. We want to tell the families, it's all good, we have so many good things to do this. For establishing screening, we have to be the spoilers. We have to say, listen, yes, I'm an optimist, but look at the numbers. The numbers are not good. And in order to do something, we need to establish the diagnosis at an early stage, because this is the only option that we have to find those new treatments, which I think are out there, but we need scientific studies to prove it, because already now so many families go into alternative things which are not scientifically proven, and this is of course a catastrophe, because we need science to give good recommendations.
Yeah, thank you very much. I would actually also invite the broader audience to ask questions. So are there any particular questions to Thomas? Thomas has to leave a bit earlier, so if you have questions, maybe now, better. And we have more microphones. I don't see directly. Maybe one more point in terms of the age. Do you think it is also an advantage to know that if you have passed a certain age, your risk is lower, or you have received already 1 or 2 negative test results, then this is also can be a relief to families?
I think all the families that have experience with diabetes, it's a large relief, of course. For those families who don't have diabetes in their family, you know, they don't really know what this is really about. And this is, of course, another thing which I think we have to work on to make the general public much more aware what type 1 diabetes really means, as people don't understand it. And this is another prerequisite that we need for general acceptance of such a screening in general healthcare. So I think we really have to do 2 things. We have to make it very clear, even with the most modern types of therapy, we are not achieving what I as a father would like for my children if they would have diabetes. And number 2, there is good reason to believe that we will be able to find new treatments. I think this is also important. And number 3, we can do it. We have shown that this early screening is feasible, that it's working, and so let's do it.
Yeah.
Thanks. You know, if I listen to you, Thomas, I would say, hey, you know, I'm clear. I need to put this into the screening system. And I'm so what really is the hindrance, in your opinion, that we can't, you know, what are the things that saying, hey, what do we have to overcome, essentially? I mean, you said, you know, you gave the reasons why we should do it. What is the reason why we still can't do that?
Ignorance, and ignorance on the side of the payers. Many payers feel that, you know, we're already doing so much for type 1 diabetes, and it's, you know, we have technology and all these things, it's kind of solved. There's no real issue. So we have to be a spoiler here. Number 2 is they are afraid of the logistics involved. So they say they have to be convinced that it's feasible. I hope we were able to show that. And so we, you know, let's put it this way. If a drug company wants to put a drug to market, they have a whole market access group who is really going to all the payers, going to all the decision makers, and, you know, sits with them in long hours, convincing them that drug number X is the next best thing. We don't have these market access people, to be honest, who are sitting together with all the payers and convincing them.
So, John Todd from Oxford, if in Britain, in England and Wales, the NHS, it would come down to hard money. What is the cost saving for the NHS if we do this? So how much money is saved by reducing hospitalisation? And the numbers would have to be calculated. If there was a cost saving, the NHS would adopt it.
Well, John, to be honest, I mean, you have to look into quality years of life. And I guess if we take those Swedish 17 years for the girls, and this is the population we're talking about. We're talking about the below 10s. That's exactly what the Swedish have studied. And what they have established is that the risk for complications and early death is much higher in the youngest age group. And this is the one age group that we're facing when we're doing the screening. And so I think just by the mere numbers, 17 and 14 for boys, I think the math is there.
So if you go to somebody in the government or a government body like in Britain, NICE, you know, the regulatory body, and you say, I've got something really important, but it won't happen for 20 years, they're not interested.
This is why I think that where the community of type 1 patients comes in. And they have done miracles in the United States in many ways, what they were able to do. And I just wish that we would be able to get a similar movement happening in Europe.
So I think we move on to in the discussion. Thomas, thank you very much for your statement and for the discussion points. Helena, I wanted to ask you, and you have experience from Sweden. We always hear that preventing DKA is not enough, but on the other hand, we have no intervention to stop the disease in hand. What is your position? Why do we hear that, or what could be an argument against it? Why is preventing DKA and improving outcomes so important?
I mean, I think as a pediatrician who have seen children with DKA and some very young children in very bad shape with DKA, I think it's an enormous improvement if you can prevent DKA, of course. And it's also cost saving because it costs a lot to be on the intensive care unit and so on. So just to prevent DKA, I think, is a reason to screen. But I also know that in Sweden we have a problem to say that this is the thing we want to do. We should, the Swedish government want to have some kind of cure as well. I think that if we can show that if you are diagnosed early with a better HbA1c, and if that may save years of life, or if that may save us some complications, then perhaps we can do screening in Sweden. I think that is the way we have to do. Even if I think that DKA is really, really important to prevent, I think that we have to show that we have some kind of long-term other kind of improvement as well.
I mean, maybe I can ask this also to all of you. I mean, what is your view here? Because I think that is very important, that many studies have shown that you can improve quality of life, you can improve the condition, the metabolic control, and of course you prevent some very severe DKA cases that also very occasional patients who die of DKA. So is this something that can be accepted as such, or do we need further studies? Do we need to provide more information? And a little bit I look at you, Professor Hoffmann is actually the director or the leader of the screening commission in Germany, and has an important role also to tell us what the expectations may be for such a test to become reality when integrated into public health. So maybe you can already comment on that point.
Yes, I can, and it's a little difficult because I have also 2 roles at least. I also have 5 children, but in this sort of screening, it's very different from our world of pediatricians. Fortunately, it's changing a little, but it's very different also from country to country. And of course, we have colleagues here from different countries. Sweden is halfway screening friendly. England and Switzerland are just on the other side. It's very different because otherwise we propose that we all follow the same principles, which we don't really, because the results, our genes are all the same, of course. I would say 2 bad things in the beginning, just also to put water into wine, or just say, traditionally screening was even rejected for adrenogenital syndrome, and of course being in this crisis is not much better than as a newborn than a diabetic ketoacidosis. Also the mortality is even higher, and it was rejected for a long time until we really could show that we have only half the numbers of boys in our clinics, and so many not only went into crisis but died apparently, and we know this from families without being recognized. This finally broke the way, or paved the way for, and similarly for galactosemia, which of course is quite deadly in the beginning. I think it's about 20-30% still. And still some countries like Canada said it's only to be done in, we should find them symptomatically, because you would really, I think, with diabetic screening, like I know the literature so far, and unfortunately missed the Frederick part, I think in Germany, and it's a national system, the Germans don't care anything about numbers from other countries, and I'm afraid, which makes screening for Luxembourg, no, they may accept they send the sample somewhere else. But I know, for example, tyrosinemia type 1, which is frequent in other countries, it's completely deadly, was really not accepted for a long time because they said in Germany we need German numbers. Here I think in the middle term it's wonderful that we have these studies, including the consent of and the view of the pediatricians, of the families. And this would give me some hope, rather middle term, to the screening in Germany. I don't know what it would be then in Switzerland or England. But I would then concentrate just on Germany because that's the issue for me, and at least I know the other countries also quite well, but just to study on this. So I think, and of course if one country comes up, it may help, but France is still not screening anything what we did for the last 20 years. I don't know if any French colleagues are around here, but it's a catastrophe. Because they don't accept it, and there are things that they have 5 screening dots in the newborn screening, and they say we have a center, one laboratory for each disease, and we have 5 centers, so we don't have a 6th dot. There are completely bureaucratic and crazy things. For Germany, I think it would be possible. The most wonderful thing is if one could really show at least a partial prevention of appearance of, because people still would not care anything about 17 years. You have not shown in any way that if you find them before the diabetic ketoacidosis that they live 17 years longer. So I would say you are completely unscientific, forget it. Show me this, and then it's, and even in the middle term. And we had the same in CF. And we were fighting for 11 years to get CF screening there. The Brits at least had a prime minister whose child had CF, so this helped. And we may have a new prime minister someday too. But but anyway, so the Germans were really blocking this. Although it was clearly shown that it's cost effective, the children with CF, which you find early, have in the first 10 years far less costs. They live longer, at least at 15 years. It was finally introduced when we had the first drug which really went specifically. So I don't know, CF is of course a different, ethically also a different disease. You had the question of eugenics in Germany, which you wouldn't have with the diabetes, I guess. So I think you could even go this if you carefully can present what I've heard. This would be enough. But if you would be able to show that at least a significant portion can even be preventive, if you, let's say, use the newborn screening cards, you could then start with 4 or 5 months of age with the intervention. This would be, then it would become, that would be the great, and the other is that it's not the screening committee, we are just advising, and of course this is a huge body, and but you could also prevent numbers. We could, in your study, you could calculate it what the average diabetic ketoacidosis costs and what the screening costs, but I'm not so sure if it would come to positives because, and even CF it was positive and wasn't accepted. So then the positive apply from the colleagues and the parents. But I don't know what the first numbers are. It's a bad thing is also, at least for Germany, if it's rejected once, you need another 10 years to come back. So if you present it next year, and in 3 years you have a positive reply for real prevention. And it's like many political things, unpredictable, but I think the background is wonderful. And I, as a pediatrician, would then, 20 years ago, I also cared for diabetic children. Of course, in my hospital we see ketoacidosis. But if you go to these tables and circles, that's not what it's accepted there. But you do have these data. If you could really calculate this, and of course you have the Diabetic Association, which is even much stronger than the Cystic Fibrosis Association. So there are good and bad points, and Germany is so in between. And there are, of course, others like the US, they screen anything, even if it's not a disease or you have no treatment, and so you make the parents crazy if you find it. So I think maybe also in the US they would even start it. I'm surprised they didn't. But then, of course, you can get additional data. But I think in Germany, either if you don't, you could do it now, or if you have really a good way of considering that there will be something positive in a year or two, put this in, and then it would probably go, because diabetes is quite well accepted. It's a disease which is on the mind, and it's for children. I would suspect it. Of course, then the early diagnosis, of course, makes sense.
Thank you so much. Are there any other questions to Helena or Professor Hoffmann? Also from our round. If not, maybe we can move on, Joerg Hasford, to the ethical perspective. So is there anything from an ethical point of view, we are always also discussing burden to the family of screening, that you think is very important and relevant, and what can you advise us in this direction?
Advice is not so easy, but let it say it that way. I think the discussion about ethics of screening is a very old discussion. I think even when I was trained as a doctor, we discussed this already. But, and it's always the same, the major question is, it's somehow considered to somehow unethical to screen for diseases where there is no cure. So that's the first question. In this situation, we don't screen for disease. That's the difference, I think, also with CF and things, or PK, phenylketonuria. These people are really sick, and we screen for sick people. But here we screen for high-risk patients who have an elevated risk, a higher risk than normal to develop a disease. One has to keep that difference also in mind. And having said that, if the patient or the child gets sick, there is a treatment. We cannot cure the disease, but we can treat it. So that is fulfilled. But here we have only a probability or a certain risk that someone develops the disease. And then that makes it a little bit more complicated to say immediately you have to screen. And therefore I think you have to show that early diagnosis, even before someone is sick, has an added value, provides an added value with regard to the child and the parents. And is there empiric evidence available for this? And we know that in Germany, money plays a major role, to say it somehow frankly. And we have all these nice institutes and the Gemeinsame Bundesausschuss who decides about these things. And they look very much on very strong evidence and very much empirical evidence. And if that is not available, at least from comparable countries, I think it will be very hard to achieve that. But also from an ethical point, it makes sense to ask for that. Let's say in the early 50s or the 50s, there were so many children who were somehow diagnosed with a sick heart, a heart disease. The doctor had heard something, and I think there were in those days many somehow children raised who were not allowed to play football, soccer, and all these kinds of things. The doctor said you might have a heart defect and it's dangerous, things like that. And one has to pay attention to the social costs. If you have a parent and you tell them they have a 25% risk or 55% risk, and you have to show, I think, also data that you can ease this burden and make people have a good living with having that. And there's always a chance that the child never develops type 1 diabetes. And I think in these areas where the ethical questions somehow concentrate and focus on these issues. And if you can provide data that you have, if this trial provides good data, then I think we have a very good support. The other one is to show that the early diagnosis, even before the disease really occurs, has an added value compared to a later one, not only in money terms, but also from a kind of health benefit. And if you can show that, then I think from an ethical point of view, there are no problems. And then one should support it, of course. Still, it seems that it may take a long time, but it's not anymore an ethical issue.
I mean, you had not the opportunity, I know, to attend the afternoon. So I just wanted to repeat very briefly that we have discussed in the afternoon 2 different approaches. So the one is the genetic screening, where only in our current, for example, GPPAD screening situation, we know that only 1 of 10 or more than 1 of 10 children will then develop and progress to diabetes. But we have also discussed the screening of autoimmunity, and here we actually know that near to 100% of the children develop the diabetes, and we know also that 50%, half of them develop within 5 years. So there's also a half who take longer than 5 years until they become symptomatic. And of course, I think I understand that we have to look at these 2 different ways of screening in a different manner. And probably the first one would be the screening for autoimmunity that meets the criteria that you were talking about, where we think that there is already evidence that it's beneficial. And the screening for risk is maybe a more difficult step because we have not everybody who develops and progresses. Yeah.
I think if that is what is true, what I assume, then I think there's no ethical issue in that. We have, of course, also in the ethical issues always a discussion about the right to not know. But I think parents, with regard to their kids, it might not be that there is a right to not know if it's beneficial for the children. So the parents cannot claim a right to not know that there is a health risk for the children. And I think the court rulings are typically in Germany in favor of the interest of the child and not with regard to the rights of the parents if the health of the children is at risk. So I think then, if that's the situation, I see no really ethical issues anymore.
Just a comment, there is at least 1 study that shows that if you have children that have been followed before the diagnosis, they have a lower HbA1c when they start the diagnosis, but they actually have a lower HbA1c up to 5 years after diagnosis as well. And that is mostly when you have lost your C-peptide. So I think that may be beneficial in a long run as well. So I think that is something to use as well.
I think you want
I have an addition to this, because we have been studying the issue, especially on false positive, which quite often catastrophic results. It depends on the way this is presented and all the information provided. So from personal issues, I would remember that people have heard for phenylketonuria. It's all much better now. The children were dead, but now they will only be retarded, or your milk is poisonous, and of course there's also a 1 on 10, 90% never have it. And I guess but these were days where I hope, at least from the studies, where the information is much better. But I think it would also be, I'm not sure, because I missed the first part, if autoimmunity would be enough for prevention. Because then you would need the neonatal or post-neonatal screening where there is no antibody yet there. I don't know. Is this the case?
Of course, we are also having studies to try to reverse autoimmunity, but
Okay.
it may be more difficult than preventing it. But these studies are also ongoing.
But I don't know if it's in your arms, but it would be important to investigate also the false positives, or it must be difficult to talk to them again when they are 5 years older and have never had any autoantibodies, any diabetes. Of course, there is a lot of harm sometimes, really measurable harms to children who are false positives. There are harms on different levels. One is that the parents don't believe that it's false positives. So I'm mainly involved in rare genetic diseases, so even the community doesn't know about them. So here with diabetes, it may even be worse because the neighbors know about diabetes. And still, you can 100% exclude it. I mean, if my genes are negative, the disease is 1,000%, it's not there. And still, the parents, it's been shown for a higher percentage, treat their children differently for years to come. And there was this study from Munich where our two groups did prospective studies, and we had one disease where we can, in the end, reduce the alarm, but still the parents don't believe it. They would even say because it's monogenic, they would still abort another child which has not even a disease. And they don't believe they can relax the treatment. And maybe you can investigate, put an arm in this. So what we have in the classical screening issue so far in these monogenic diseases, it's quite alarming, the effect of false positives.
We would, of course, not say, I'm sorry, that they are false positive. We have followed children up to 30 years now, and we see many that, and the majority who progresses, so it's not false positive, but they take just longer.
But it's a question how you bond to your child, how you treat your child for 30 years. If I know on day one after birth, it may have diabetes. It has effect on your children, and it's not a positive effect.
There was a comment.
You touched on it briefly just then, but I did want to ask the question about reproductive confidence. So if you were screening from birth and you're the first child in a family and the child is found to be at high risk, have you, in your experience with GPPAD, seen whether this affects future reproductive confidence for that family, and have you considered what the implications for that might be?
It's of course a relevant question, but we have not the data because we are screening since 1 year, so we don't know. I think nobody has that data, but maybe I can ask if somebody wants to comment on that. So,
I don't think we have seen anything like that in TEDdy, because in TEDdy also the parents have been informed about the child's diabetes risk. And in TEDdy we also have shown that the parents are not very worried about the diabetes risk. Even if this is a study, of course, I think that it's anyway important to show that the parents aren't very worried.
Yeah. So I would like to echo that if I can. I think behavior in families where there already is someone with type 1 diabetes, they probably have, and they're varied in how they do that, and some families ignore it and some families take note. In the TEDdy families and in all the other studies, that there's been a lot of effort done to find out how they change the behavior, etc. The behavior, there are some families, there are some, but as an overall, it is generally not considered to be an issue for them. And those families that do participate, and especially those that find out that the child is antibody positive, I mean, Annette, you know, I guess you guys and Helena, you have a lot of experience in how it is for those families to be diagnosed early and what they think about that. But I think it's in general, find it helpful.
So maybe we can at that point turn to, we have a family with us. Thank you so much for being here, that actually participated in Frederick in Saxony, and also is enrolled in Point. And maybe you want just to comment a little bit what you hear. Can you say something how it affects you, or you can also speak in German and I can translate if that is easier.
Okay, in German is better because then more emotions in the speech, and I hope you can help me.
Just to say what you
Okay, ja, also wir haben eigentlich im Grunde genommen im Vorfeld eigentlich wenig über Typ 1 gehört. Persönlich hatten wir eigentlich ja auch familiär bedingt Typ 2 Erfahrung. Das ist eigentlich so die Geschichte eigentlich, die so das Volk so ein bisschen kennt. Nicht von der Straße, aber Typ 1 weiß man relativ wenig. Also was ich von außen so berichten kann als Außenstehender. Und ja, gut, Typ 2 ist Typ 2, Typ 1 ist was ganz Neues. Und persönlich muss ich sagen, dass ich seit 2 Jahren eine Arbeitskollegin selber habe, die Typ 1 hat. Und natürlich führt man da Gespräche und hinterfragt. Mittlerweile, ja, sie hat einen gesunden Sohn geboren, ist 38 Jahre alt, kann ja, Sport machen, alles Mögliche und normal leben. Und das war so der Anstoß. So. Und nun ist halt vor 11 Monaten unser Sohn geboren. Und also im Seenlandklinikum in Hoyerswerda, also ganz in der Nähe, und in Zusammenarbeit mit der Universität macht dieses Klinikum halt diese Studie, und nach der Geburt des Kindes ist man eigentlich so ein bisschen überrannt. Ja, hier wurde eine Studie gemacht, sinngemäß, und hier wird Blut abgenommen, und warum, wieso, weshalb? Ja, Risikoeinschätzung, Diabetes Typ 1, okay. Gut, das macht man halt mal mit. Im Grunde genommen sind wir als Familie sehr gesundheitsaffin, dass man denkt, man tut immer was Gutes. Na klar macht man da mit bei dieser Studie, um das Ganze zu unterstützen. Und dann tut man das. Aber man ist natürlich erstmal von diesen geburtstechnischen Geschichten, man ist jetzt Eltern geworden, ziemlich überrascht und beachtet das eigentlich gar nicht. Und dann lässt man sich auf die Studie ein, und das ist erstmal gut und das ist erstmal schön. Und ein paar Wochen später ist man dann schon überrascht, hey, da kam ein Anruf und da kam halt Post von Dresden, und ja, aber prinzipiell, wir haben uns halt in diese Studie dann dafür entschieden, dass wir daran teilnehmen, weil im Grunde genommen, man unterstützt ja quasi die Gesundheit unseres Kindes im Vorfeld. Und ja, im Grunde genommen auch man hilft ja der Forschung trotzdem weiter. Und wir sind durch das Team in Dresden super aufgenommen worden und fühlen uns pudelwohl und kommen gern eben hierher. Natürlich ist es für den Kleinen immer so ein bisschen ein kleines Drama, 5 Minuten Zeit zu investieren, zwecks dieser Blutabnahme. Aber ja, der zieht das durch, und da sind wir eigentlich relativ glücklich. Und es ist ja nicht
No, I just want to give you an idea about, so he said first that, of course, he didn't really hear much about type 1 diabetes. They were much more familiar what type 2 diabetes is, what one hears all the time, but not really what type 1 diabetes is. But then he had actually a colleague at work that had type 1 diabetes, and this is when you first heard about it. And of course, one is then a little bit more susceptible about this disease. And I think then when your son was born and you were approached in the clinic to do this test, one on the one side thinks, of course, one wants to do everything what is the best for one child, and why not also testing for type 1, and because one heard about this disease already, one decides for it, but one, of course, at that time doesn't really expect to receive a positive result. But when you receive the positive result, then you decided to participate also and enroll in the prevention study. And this is, I think, also because you want to really support research and want to support the development here, and that you also say that you really thought that it was helpful to be in the center, and you are well perceived. And it is, of course, a little bit of a burden for the child to have the blood draws, but altogether you think that you are very well taken care of here. So you can continue. I'm sorry, but I just wanted to give the others the idea. Wollten Sie noch was sagen, oder dann kommen wir später nochmal auf Sie zurück? Okay, then maybe we continue here. And I wanted now to ask Reinhard Berner, a little bit from the pediatrician's perspective also, do you really think that the pediatric society would be ready for such a screening? So if it was implemented, what has to change in the regular care? How do we have to educate all the pediatricians, or could this be immediately happening?
Yes, thank you. I thought it's a simple question, and I would have liked to say yes, it's no problem to integrate this in the regular pediatric standard care program, but realizing that the rate of ketoacidosis, for example, in Germany has not changed in the last 20 years, I became a little bit more skeptical. I thought this diabetes type 1 is a very well-known disease in the medical and the pediatric community. It should be no problem to implement a program to screen and prevent for diabetes. But a rate of 25% of ketoacidosis in children in Germany makes clear that the awareness of type 1 diabetes is not as high as I would have expected. So to integrate, or is the system ready to provide the needed care? Probably not at the moment. I think it would be extremely important to integrate such a program in the standardized care program, in the checkups, in the routine checkups. And another issue that is very important, that it has to be in any way has to be reimbursed. The pediatricians in Germany probably would not be able to integrate, or would not be willing to integrate that in the daily work because of the enormous workload they have in some periods of time. So one would have to be very, it would have to be really integrated in what exists at the moment. That means the standard program, and the time that costs to talk with parents has to be reimbursed in any way.
And do you think there is a problem because the regular pediatrician doesn't have and may not have the specific knowledge about diabetes, and to refer to special centers? Is that network well enough established? We noticed a little bit in Frida that our coordinating center helped a little bit in this transfer and needed to help in this transfer. How could that be facilitated in a way? Or is that, for example, in Sweden, no problem at all, or would it also be difficult?
I think if you want to do a general screening, that means to, for example, to screen any newborn, then you would not be able to do this by the diabetes centers, the education.
No, but if somebody is positive, I mean.
Yeah, okay.
And then who is looking after this?
Yeah, we're talking about antibody positives now, is that right?
Antibody, okay.
Yeah.
Antibody positives, okay. Yes, the pediatricians have to get educational program, and then it must be integrated in the routine standard care to talk to the parents and to educate them. To add something additional to what they have to do in the daily routine, that would not be feasible, I think.
How do you see that in Sweden?
In Sweden, most children don't go to any pediatrician at all. It's just if they get ill. So in Sweden, we would have to educate the pediatricians at the hospitals or at the primary care centers to take care of these children with antibodies. And another thing that I have realized is that we are starting to get quite good at taking care of those early diagnosed children in Skåne, since we have so many at the different clinics. But if you have those kind of children in other sites in Sweden, they may be a little bit confused. Okay, when will I start insulin, and how do I do with the education? When do I start the carb counting and so on? So I think we have to think one more time and educate the whole diabetes society in Sweden. I think that is possible and not so hard, but I think we have to do it.
And sometimes even we don't know when to start insulin. Yeah, I mean, there's not so much standard yet. Please.
I mean, as I'm also practicing in Germany, but in quite a different country again. It's not Bavaria, it's Baden-Württemberg, and it's very different from Lower Saxony, where I was trained. I would suggest that you would be the leading person to make a mixture. A normal pediatrician is not competent enough to talk to the parents. Full stop. Diabetes, I don't know exactly, but it probably has about double the incidence of CF. And the worst which can happen after screening that a pediatrician or any doctor who is just a doctor, and we have family pediatricians, so that's different from Sweden, but still they have around 6,000-8,000 patients in their practice, which means every third practice or second practice has one child of diabetes, and usually they go to one practice, so a lot of practices will never have a child for 10 years. And in 10 years, they have so many questions at the first time. I mean, you need something including internet. They should go to a center once, because, I mean, it's a Swedish. Our parents go to IKEA once they get a child, and they travel 50 kilometers or 100. It's no problem to go to IKEA. So it should not be a problem to really design. You have time to make in the countries, our areas are very different. Of course, in the densely populated state like Baden-Württemberg, there should be less problems, but still we have all these things. There should be a competent, there's also something, if the first, after a screening result, if the first encounter with the information and what you hear is not perfect, I don't understand it really, but these parents and the children will, or the children will, they don't hear it, but the parents will never forget it. And the overall, how they cope with the disease is on a different competence for 20, 30, 40 years. It's not, I mean, I'm not a psychologist, so I don't understand it, but it's really true, and they will always mistrust. So we have it in other diseases. We made these mistakes, and we can see if they were not properly counted. The first talk is the most important. So I think there they should come to a center, and then our pediatricians are not bad. So I think then the follow-up and some additional thing, what diabetes is in general, they do know. But the first talk should be, and with help, and we see catastrophic things in Germany because we are not completely centered and have to do it like this in CF screening now. And there is a lot of harm being done, unfortunately.
But we know from children with rheumatic diseases that if they go to the specialist and they are informed about the disease, they half a day later they come to their pediatrician and ask what they never told me. He told me nothing, and I don't know anything about the disease. So if we want to implement this in the routine, you have to educate the pediatricians, the general pediatricians. They have to know about the disease, they have to know about the screening, they have to know about what means autoantibody positivity, and that they will come back to their family pediatrician, and they will ask him what he thinks about this screening, or about treatment, and about care of the patient.
And I think normally they also do really. Our experience is actually quite positive in Frida, and we even received emails from pediatricians thanking us that they now have so much more understanding of type 1 diabetes that they never had before through participation in Frida. So I think we can also change it by having programs like this. So I think. I wanted to come to Jessica Dunne. Jessica is from the Juvenile Diabetes Research Foundation, so she is representing those who are funding these studies. And you are also an organization that is really, you have a large lay community who is actually supporting you, so who is part of the Jdrf, and so what is the Jdrf perspective, why you are funding these studies, why you are also really supporting such initiatives in a lot of countries now and or regions, and how does your lay community within the Jdrf see this development?
Yeah, thanks, Annette. I think I'm struck by a number of things that I've heard this evening from the panelists. And to start off with Annette's question about why Jdrf is interested in this, I think first and foremost, we've heard horror stories of, as was mentioned before, about families diagnosed in DKA. And through studies like Frida and Teddy and others, we can show that DKA is preventable. As Annette pointed out today, the only DKA child in Frida was somebody that did not enroll in the monitoring. So it's not just about screening. We've been talking a lot about screening today, but as Teddy has well shown as well, that it's about the screening and the monitoring. The monitoring is the key piece, which we seem to have forgotten a little bit today, this evening in our discussions, but came up a little bit in this last piece about how do we educate the physicians, how do we implement the plans for the monitoring. And so first and foremost, we think that reduction of DKA is important, not just for the immediate effects that it has on the parents and the children and the physicians and the community, but also for the long-term effects. As Annette showed the data from the Colorado Center showing the reduction in A1C numbers 15 years out. And we know that A1C numbers also have a very large impact in terms of long-term complications. So as we think about how we build out the economic case for it, as we can reduce DKA rates, we can start making these leaps to reduction of DKA rates, reduction of A1C numbers, reduction of long-term complications. It's sort of a cascade effect. And so that's where we really see the field going. And first and foremost, we're really driven by the patient voice. And as Thomas had said earlier, Jdrf has played a big role, at least in the United States, in sort of pushing through our agenda as being able to be an advocate for people living with type 1 diabetes. And so we think this is really, where we want to go next in terms of this. One of the other things we're doing along with the Helmsley Charitable Trust is a patient and physician preference study in terms of what patients and parents will accept in terms of screening, in terms of how the frequency, in terms of if you could only reduce DKA or if there's a preventative therapy available. And so we'll get some ideas hopefully within the next 6 months or so about, at least in the US markets, and we're happy to replicate those findings and those studies in other countries as well, about what parents and physicians really find acceptable, and to be able to help us identify some of the barriers in terms of moving this forward. And then the last piece I want to just also briefly mention, with respect to, I do agree that one of the reasons we're focusing on the autoantibody screening is because of the positive predictive value of those children getting type 1 diabetes. The assays are excellent. They're very, highly sensitive and highly specific right now, the ones that are in use. It's a little bit of a double-edged sword when we think about preventative therapies as well. Without screening these individuals to find them to be able to do the studies, we're never going to be able to find a preventative therapy. So it's great that we have these clinical, the research studies. We're never going to be at this scale. We're never ever going to be able to do a phase 3 study. We're never going to be able to get to that sort of stage in in these research studies. So this is also another reason why we think about implementing the general population screening. And the other thing we haven't talked about today that Jdrf has a keen interest on is in these autoantibody positive individuals, delaying progression. We often talk about preventing type 1 diabetes altogether, but delaying progression. So if you look at the numbers in the US, and they're quite similar here in Europe, about the average age of diagnosis in children, it's between 5 and 14. And if you look, the T1D exchange, which was a group of clinical centers that looked at just standard of care, and this is at very good clinical centers, so the real data is probably a lot more scary than what the T1D exchange showed that glucose control is terrible over the adolescent period for all the same reasons that adolescence is terrible, right? So, but you know, I just mentioned that adolescence period is terrible in terms of glucose control, and then I just mentioned that the average age of diagnosis is in that peri-adolescent period. So if we could start, again, delaying progression in these individuals, not necessarily preventing it altogether, obviously that's the holy grail, but in terms of delaying progression as well, I think we can also build out not just the realistic case for it, but also the economic case for it, because again, the glucose control has an effect on long-term complications. So I know I've touched on a lot, you know, but I was trying to respond to many of the points that were raised this evening. So I'll stop there. John.
Thank you. John.
A short comment. So my colleague in Oxford, Rachel Besser, who's the lead pediatrician for diabetes, we've been discussing stress in adolescents during exam time and if it influences their performance. And in Britain, the Medical Research Council and the Wellcome Trust are prioritising mental health because that's the great unmet need in westernized countries. And is greatly undermet and under-researched. So there presumably is data about stress, mental health, exam performance in adolescents with type 1 diabetes and adolescents without type 1 diabetes. And that might be another justification to add to what we've heard this evening.
Yeah, no, it's a good point. Is there other questions? Maybe that leads very much to Megan. You are in Australia doing a study where you have a focus on really finding also out what is causing this disease. And we have the screening in the small children. And when we talk about intervention, about preventing progression, what you said, and combining this, what we know already from the pathogenesis, we always ask us what interventions and possibilities for interventions do we have already to really go into these babies and small children. And sometimes a big list of possible intervention becomes very small when we speak about a 2-year-old. So do we have interventions that we can use today, or what do we know, need to know in the future to be able to do this for children?
Yeah, thank you. So I think when we think about prevention, it has to be split into the two arms, being primary and secondary prevention. So I guess when we're talking about genetic screening, identifying people who have not yet progressed down the path of developing type 1 diabetes, we're talking about primary prevention. When we're talking about antibody screening and identifying people who have already commenced a destructive autoimmune process, we're talking about secondary prevention. I think primary prevention also could be further split into general population and first-degree relatives. So the NDO study is particularly focused on exposures during pregnancy, and I think that, I guess with the exception of assisted reproductive technologies, we are not sampling routinely the genes of a fetus. So I think that any intervention in pregnancy will probably be focused on a first-degree relative population. The other issue with primary prevention is that any intervention has to be extremely safe, because what we're doing is intervening in a non-medical state. This is not somebody who is ill at all, and therefore we have to be 100% certain that the intervention is not going to cause any harm. So Len has provided me with a bit of a list of some of the possible interventions that we have, and I would invite anybody who has something to contribute to this list far beyond my level of expertise to do so. But some of the things that Len has put down here is targeting the islet autoantigens, so insulin, proinsulin, C-peptide, GAD65 proteins or peptides. That may be a target of some therapies. Other things that we can do would be involving diet supplementation with bacteria, so probiotics, or the products of bacteria, so short-chain fatty acids. And indeed, there are studies that are happening in Australia at the moment to look at the safety profile of some of those types of interventions in people who are already living with type 1 diabetes. We could also look at repurposing existing drugs that we know to be safe, and this is particularly important in pregnancy. So the examples that I have are methyl-dopa and metformin. And the concept of vaccinations, if indeed the trigger of type 1 diabetes was found to be viral, then there may be opportunities to create vaccines against those viral targets, which would effectively become a vaccine against type 1 diabetes. And you know, we have large programs in Australia for vaccinating pregnant women against things like influenza. So that's a possibility. But potentially combinations of these things may be relevant if indeed the trigger of type 1 diabetes is different in people based on their genetic background. Then we may need to consider multiple types of interventions in order for those interventions to be effective. So that's the list that I've been given. And if anyone would like to extend upon that, I would welcome them to do so.
I don't necessarily have anything to extend to that. I just have one comment with respect to risk-benefit when we talk about prevention. And I think you're right, primary prevention is different than secondary prevention. And I think one of the things that we're trying to do, you know, in the US with the FDA is try to change the risk-benefit perspective, especially in individuals in stage 2. So this is where a type 1 diabetes diagnosis is imminent. And, you know, and lest we forget that type 1 diabetes is a deadly disease, and insulin we're giving then a lethal drug, insulin, into the hands of individuals and sending them home with this and saying, you know, if you dose it too high, you give too much insulin, you know, you can go into a hypo state. If you dose too little, you can go into a hyper state. You know, if we really step back and think about it, insulin has a very narrow therapeutic range that's influenced by what you eat, how much you're sleeping, what kind of exercise you're doing, and we're giving it all to the hands of the patient. So one of the things that we're trying to do is sort of re-educate the regulators in terms of the fact that this is the case. And even with insulin, we are not, you know, individuals are not reaching their targets. And so this idea of even delaying progression and keeping individuals off of insulin, I think we can, you know, I think if we start having those discussions about risk-benefit, at least our initial discussions, that the regulators at least seem open to having that discussion about changing the risk-benefit profile.
Yeah, no, thank you. That's a very, very good point. Any other questions? Then maybe yeah.
I also think that if you do primary prevention, you have to think about the genetic profile. As we have seen in Teddy, that some children start with insulin autoantibodies and other with GAD autoantibodies, and there may be different triggers in those.
No, I think that's also a very important point, that there's more and more evidence that there may be different, so we say, endotypes of type 1 diabetes, and they differ by the age when this process starts and by the antigen and the antibodies, and that, of course, needs to be considered genetically as well. Maybe because I think we don't have so much time left, and Koralova is from Helmsley, and Helmsley, you heard, is really not only funding and supporting GPPAD, but and the primary prevention, but also supporting secondary prevention programs, and has really initiated this enormous European initiative to get one step further into the disease. But a critical part of all this is, of course, the screening for risk. So what is the Helmsley perspective, and why you started all this program and supported it so much?
Okay, well, I think that many of you know that the Helmsley T1D program, the inspiration for it is David Penzier, our trustee's oldest daughter, who was diagnosed with type 1 diabetes around the same time that he became a trustee. But a couple of years after that, he also learned that his younger daughter had a very high risk of developing the disease. So I think that they represent two populations of people, and I'm not going to call them patients, who the Helmsley T1D program, you know, really is looking to serve people who are living with the disease today, and then people who are at risk for it. So, you know, you can take from that statement that prevention is a huge priority for us. You know, we, like probably everybody here, believe that prevention is going to be much more effective than treating the symptoms with a not ideal drug, or even reversing damage, which may or may not be possible. So I think, you know, Anetta's question to me was about our investments in Europe. And I think that there's a couple of reasons that we made the decision to invest, relatively heavily in Europe, the first and foremost is really the expertise and experience of the investigators here. I don't think I have to argue that to anybody here that both of those things are significant. And it's not just type 1 diabetes I'm talking about clinical studies. Older ones, more recent ones, the breadth of them is really impressive. And then the second thing is the environment. So we've heard the comment from several different people that, each country is going to be different. We've heard the presentations that each state in the countries are going to be different. So the experience from Hanover is going to be different from the experience in Munich. And an effort like GPPAD really gives you the opportunity to test the feasibility of prevention in a lot of different countries and a lot of different healthcare systems, which I think is really an amazing opportunity.
I think that is important, and I think maybe I wanted to ask whether is it something also that we have to follow up more closely how the different healthcare systems can or are different, and also the aspect of saving costs. I know that we discussed this at the beginning and then kind of didn't follow it up, but it may become a role more and more also in terms of prevention. So is Helmsley also investing in this, and not necessarily in Europe, but to think how much would a prevention effort also save costs, not only the screening, but the prevention?
Yeah, I think that cost is going to be a driver anywhere for anything medically related, obviously. Not just in Europe, in the US especially, where we have very high healthcare costs. Jessica had mentioned that we're partnered on this effort to understand more about the things that drive the general pediatrician and families to participate in screening. We have other things going on that we're looking at, not just the cost, again, of preventing DKA, because you made the point that the cost of preventing DKA can't balance out the cost of screening everybody in the general population, but also looking at healthcare utilization for those people who are diagnosed with DKA differentially from those who can be diagnosed without DKA, and their both immediate healthcare utilization versus their long-term healthcare utilization. I think, in an ideal situation, we would care what the cost is 30 years down the road, but for most healthcare systems, they have a much shorter view. So we need to look at those, and we are making some efforts in that regard.
Okay, thank you very much. Are there any other questions from the audience or from our panel? So if that's not the case, I think I would just give everybody a last round of statement. Maybe Reinhard, you want to start where we are now with the screening. What is the next step? Do you think we will be successful in bringing it into public health?
Yes. Of course, we have to end positive, and I think the experience in Saxony was very, very positive. That means the acceptance by parents at the time around the birth was the acceptance to participate in this genetic screening study was very high, and I'm very hopeful that this acceptance of this study will result in any time in the possibility to prevent type 1 diabetes by any intervention, and that the positivity of the parents to participate in these studies will have a good result on long term.
Okay. Yeah, I would also be positive. I'm not sure, but maybe that's also from my knowledge of the studies, if the autoimmune screening or the primary genetic screening would be better, but I think these studies will allow, and the societies and the perspectives are changing, so I think things have to be repeated. And if you could extend, or you have your data, like it was shown just recently, how the parents and the professionals involved really were positive, even in countries which not only in single centers, but I mean Bavaria is a country, of course, which is not only Munich, and diabetic centers. I would be positive, but I would be still unsure, but we don't know what's the future anyway. If the best would be really to have it in a more careful preventive setting and then do it with antibody screening included, of course with payment in Germany into the health system, and do it at 1 year or 2 years. And instead of the genetic ones, this would have to be seen, but it could also come that in 10 years we will have, from the finances, we will try to do it as a pilot anyway. It's even easy to do an exome just on any newborn and then recall the genes you want. But I don't know then again if the diabetic genes would be the ones you want at what age. But if one would put all this together, I would be hopeful that in a middle term, 2 to 3 years, we would be further, including, of course, which would change is the new therapies. If this would come in, then you have a completely big new aspects which could overhaul it. But even without it, one of these two should happen.
Yeah, I can only somehow repeat what I've said. I think individual ethics will not be a major obstacle if certain problems are solved. As I've talked about added value, what happens with the false positives, and how are the burdens of kind of this psychologists call labeling, that you get a diagnosis per se, and the social implications also in the long run with regard to having such a diagnosis. And there are many examples in history when once you mention that, we know from Canadian studies, once you get a diagnosis, you might have hypertension or you have hypertension. You make less career, you earn less, and. But from a physician's point of view, there's no need for that. I think hypertension is not such a serious disease, but that are the consequences of having gotten a diagnosis like that. And that has to be taken into account. From the individual ethical point of view, of course, every society has also only a limited amount of money for healthcare. There are other relevant interests in society too. Social security, external security, internal security, and so on. And also in the medical field, there are competing interests. And there you have also to show under the criteria of justice that this money is spent and that you get the most qualities out of every euro invested. And so there are challenges, but I think if it could be done, and perhaps one should think about what has to be done now and what can be achieved, and where are the missing points where we to put energy in it to make these black spots or white spots, whatever you call them, so that they disappear. And we can have much better arguments perhaps than we have even now. Thank you.
Yeah, I actually want to build upon what you just said. First of all, obviously, we're very supportive of identification of people at risk and having them have options for early interventions. But we do need to understand what the gaps are, not just in the clinical data, but then also in the data that you could use to speak to other decision makers, such as regulators or the screening commission and payers. And I think you need to bring those people into the conversation now, even though we are still in the research phase. Having those conversations is going to be long. It's not going to happen overnight. And we should be looking at gaps that are not just clinical data gaps.
Yeah, I think I can perhaps address this from the Australian perspective. I think, as John said, that any barrier, the major barrier to implementing a screening program in Australia would be an economic one. So I'm really interested, Anne, to hear your comments about Helmsley and Jdrf is sort of investing into putting a number figure on what prevention of DKA may mean in both the short and the long term. And I think that those arguments will be central to putting forward a concept like this in a country like Australia for it to go ahead.
Thanks. I have so many things I want to say. I don't know how to just say one. But maybe I'll just even build along what Megan and Anne just said, and just you know, as a representative of a patient advocacy organization, to never underestimate the power of the patient voice. I mean, Thomas, you know, pointed to this earlier. You know, we've had quite a lot of successes bringing patients in front of the regulators and the payers in the U.S. and are happily again to replicate that other places as well. And you know, really, I think here, when we think about the impact on the individuals, it's this reduction of DKA at diagnosis, not just for the short and long-term complications of such, but also the impact of not just the health implications, I should say, but also the emotional and other types of impacts that a diagnosis in DKA has on family members. So as we build out the case and we build out the economic model, let's not forget, you know, the impact that a diagnosis in DKA has on family members. And the numbers in the U.S. are actually quite worse. You know, Annette said 25% here in Germany. It's about 40% in the U.S. And so I think, you know, that there is a significant rationale, both in terms of the health and societal and hopefully economic basis for reduction of DKA through screening and monitoring.
Ja, also es wurden jetzt gerade die ganz wichtige Stimme auch natürlich der Familien angesprochen. Ist da noch irgendwas von Ihrer Seite, was Sie uns gerne mitgeben möchten oder sagen möchten?
In German?
Ja.
Ja, eigentlich wollten wir uns also als Familie eigentlich nochmal bedanken, dass wir die Möglichkeit überhaupt haben, an so einer Studie teilzunehmen. Also das, was ich so gehört habe jetzt, für uns ist es ja erstmal neu, dass wir überhaupt hier sind, was uns erwartet hatte. Und ich will nicht sagen, ich bin so ein bisschen schockiert, aber eigentlich können wir ja glücklich sein, also wir als Familie, dass wir überhaupt die Möglichkeit bekommen haben, an dieser Studie teilzunehmen. Viele Freunde, Bekannte, die selber Kinder geboren haben, in Kliniken, wo ich weiß, die hatten nie die Möglichkeit, von dieser Studie überhaupt zu erfahren, weil es eben noch sehr gläsern ist, nicht? Ja, Diabetes Typ 1 und ich bin froh oder wir sind froh, dass wir mit unserem kleinen Sohnemann daran teilnehmen. Aktuell ist es ja ein Risiko. Es ist ja nicht, dass es kriegen muss, also und von der Warte her sollten Kliniken oder Eltern die Möglichkeit haben, an einer Studie, also sei es wo auch immer, teilzunehmen. Ja, kann ich eigentlich nur raten oder wir können nur raten, macht mit. Also es ist definitiv nicht zum Schaden, nicht? Und ja, das sind eigentlich so die letzten Worte.
Yeah, so he said that he would actually like to thank the team that he has the opportunity to participate in this study, and he really thinks that it is a great opportunity for families to have to receive the knowledge to be able to participate in the testing and also to participate in these studies, because it is a chance and it is nothing what speaks against it in a way, and so you are actually very, very pleased that you had the possibility to do it.
For Sweden then, I think, or hope at least, that Sweden will be able to accept that we screen for antibodies and follow the ones with positive antibodies in a couple of years. That is my hope, at least. I think for primary, screening for genetic risk, then I think we have some kind of primary prevention that works, or at least that may delay the disease. But secondary prevention of, screening for antibodies, I think, is the first thing we would do.
Yeah, so I think, thank you everybody, and you know, I just want to give the perspective for A World Without One is that we have actually something for every single stage of the disease. Of course, I think it will always be that in one or the other a therapy may not work. So I think we have also to think about really primary prevention of autoimmunity, but prevention of progression, and even what can we do for those who have the disease, inject insulin to make it easier, to make it better, and that is really the idea. So I think it was an absolutely great discussion. Thank you very much for this. And we now go down and have a reception, but we also want to have a photo taken. So please go downstairs where the piano is. And this is where the photo will happen from all of us. Okay.
Thank you very much, everyone.